Cool. Figure I'll just wait a few minutes before more people are here. I figure I'll start at like 6:10. So if you know anyone who, wants to be here for this or is waiting or something, just tell them to come now, I guess. Okay, I think I'll get started now. So I guess the first thing, thank you, QSID, for having me. The second thing is just to encourage everyone to donate to the Thani Debate League. Gives free resources to 15 different like under-resourced schools in South Africa. The recommended donation is like $15 Canadian, one for each school they support. So I hope people support that. I plan on doing that after this seminar. So those are the two kind of housekeeping things. Now, just in terms of this seminar, so in this seminar, I'll be focusing on second speaking in like British parliamentary and Canadian parliamentary. I'm not going to be focusing in specifically on like deputy speech strategies or whip strategies, but more so I'm just going to be covering like the basic tools that are required to give like a really good second speech. So in this seminar, I'll be focusing on weighing, refutation, and rebuilding, and just kind of going in depth on how to do those things, what like good rebuilding looks like, what are things to avoid. Just because I find in a lot of seminars, people, or even just talking about debate and in like adjudications, people will just say, oh, you should have rebuilt more or weighed more, but not a lot of like explanation of what that really is. Just two other things, like I recommend watching the seminars on framing and on like the introduction to British parliamentary debate if you haven't, like to get the most from this seminar, I think, just because I will be talking about framing and not going very in depth in that because that had been done. And also just in the intro to BP seminar, it covers a lot of things like burdens and just like what, as a second speaker, your overall things you need to do in the round are. So I recommend watching those. There'll be three main parts to this seminar. First on like rebuilding, then on refutation, then on weighing. At the end of each section, I'll take questions on like the previous section. So if you have any questions, just like either type them in the chat so I can like just like address them as I'm moving on. But at the end of each section, I'll ask for questions. And then at the end, I'll ask for questions that are maybe more context specific, like a motion or a round you were in, or like overall strategy things with second speaking. And then if I have extra time, I'll talk about like prep time and kind of how to like act in a round if you're second speaking. Okay, so now just before rebuilding, just like the broad things about second speaking that make it unique, right? So as a second speaker, it's less about like making new arguments and building arguments. You can do this in the DPM and DLO, but you don't have to. A lot of times speakers don't, and it's not the bulk of what you're doing, right? So as a second speaker, instead of like creating something entirely new, your role in the round, like if I were to like TLDR it, I would say it's like you're the enforcer and you are the reinforcer. You are like making what your partner said more important and making sure it's credited after like another speech has just tried to make it seem unimportant. And you're also trying to make every other speech seem less important than your partner's one. The other thing I'm just going to say broadly before I get into rebuilding is second speaking and second speaking strategy, in my opinion, is highly contextual to the round that you are in. Like everything in debate is that, but not even just the motion, but also the round. So whether or not in your speech you're going to be very like offensive, like dealing with other speeches, dealing with things that have previously been said, or defensive, like supporting and building up and making your case stronger and focusing on like weighing and less direct refutation, it's something that you kind of need to decide for yourself as a second speaker, and something that over time you can kind of get a sense for, like what is more required to best beat out other teams or fulfill the burdens best. That's something I'll talk about more at the end. That's also something that judging and even just watching debate rounds can help you kind of build that feeling up of just getting used to, you know, after hearing your partner's speech, knowing do I need to push it forward more, or do I need to take down the other stuff in the round that it's like currently competing against? Okay, so now I'll talk about rebuilding. So like type questions if you have them if I'm going through at the end of this section. I'll ask other questions. So rebuilding, it's like the anti-refutation refutation, but it's important not to think of it just as like refuting what their refutation was, but doing that and also like adding more to what your partner said, and like filling in any gaps that they left. So there's kind of two different sides of the coin of rebuilding there. So when your partner's, like your partner has an argument, let's say it's been refuted. There's a couple things that you want to think about as a second speaker once that line of refutation has come out, when you're thinking about how you're going to do your rebuilding, right? Because rebuilding isn't just like saying over again what your partner just said, or saying what they said and saying, well, my partner said this, you know, we win. You have to like address the refutation that came up. So there's a couple of questions that you want to think about, right? So the first one is like, how has your partner's point been addressed and refuted, right? Was it something that the other speaker just initially dismissed as irrelevant? Was it something that they mitigated, or was it something that they outweighed? And when you're doing your rebuilding, it's always really useful, like for judges and also for you and for your standing in the round, to say what the other lines of refutation did to your case, right? Because if you say, oh, they mitigated it instead of saying that they refuted it, you're already like taking their response into a realm of thought where you're more able to deal with it. So if you're able to say, well, they just mitigated it, and then you're just able to talk more about why the impact is really important, or comparatively more important, that deals more with the mitigation rather than like just a line of refutation. Because a lot of times in rounds, teams will always say a line of refutation or a few lines and then say, we have completely taken down opening government. We have completely taken down closing opposition. They usually haven't done that, so you want to make it really clear what they have actually done. So the other thing you want to be thinking about, how has the point been addressed or refuted, is like what aspect of the point did they refute, right? Like oftentimes teams will just come up with like a mechanistic quibble in your argument, like just something as to why your mechanism won't work, and then just like refute your entire case there, right? Sometimes they'll just outweigh it. Other times, and this is when you get into like really good refutation, they're refuting the like core assumptions that lie underneath the argument you made, either being that like your world building that was implicit, or the principle or the idea of the argument, right? So the things that go like unsaid about your partner's case that they then like make explicit and then refute. So that's the first thing you want to think about, like how has the point been addressed? And then the next thing that I think is talked about a bit less, but I think is probably the most important thing to think about, is does their refutation to your case, or like whichever argument is in question currently, operate under the same logic of their case? Because a lot of times in debate, other teams will refute your case using one set of assumptions about how the world works, and their case won't operate under those same set of assumptions. And if you take one of the set of assumptions and the other, like they are contradictory. And if as a second speaker you notice this is a really big and good thing for you, right? Because what you're able to do then is like point out how logic is operated, how like they have different logic operating under their refutation and under their constructive, and then say, well, they can't have both. Either it's this side and only their refutation counts, and then you rebuild that, or it's their case and it works this way, and then you also like refute their case, right? So you're basically in that case able to like split the argument in half. This isn't something that always happens, but it is something that I have found happens at pretty much every level of debate. Like when I was a novice, this would happen. And now as I'm more experienced and in like higher level rooms, this is something that still happens. So it's just something I wanted to flag and say to look out for. I think a good example of it was like there was a round I was in this last year at Hart House where it was about whether or not development aid should be given to states or like directly to individuals. And our OO team like simultaneously made the argument that like developing countries need, like the states themselves, they were defending states, me and my partner were defending individuals. They made the claim that like states require lots of money and resources because they have a lot of poor infrastructure. And in refutation to our case, they were saying that like, well, like in weighing, like states need these things more because there's more that they can do with this money, things like infrastructure. And then in my second speech, I just said like, they say that states are bad at doing infrastructure, and they also say that they need more money to do something that they're failing at, because they never tied in like analysis about why it's just like that states need or have bad infrastructure because they don't have enough money. So even in like that kind of contradictory refutation constructive case, even just missing a few lines of analysis, you can kind of pull that card on the other team. And it's something that can be really effective, not just in ways of damaging their case, but also if you're able to like construct an argument as to why a team is contradictory, they have to spend a lot of time disproving that, which is good because it means they have less time to rebuild and support them and like continue to refute your case. So like the other question you want to ask when you're rebuilding, and this is probably like one of the most important ones, is like, has your partner already addressed their responses in some way? And if you've been like talking with your partner and thinking about things in prep time in a preemptive way, this is probably true where, you're in prep time, you want to be thinking about your arguments, not just in a vacuum, but also in about what is the other side likely to say, what are the arguments they're likely to make, how can we construct arguments that like clash against that already. So like there's two ways that like a first speaker will address like rebuttal, either explicitly by just being like, I will now pre-refute the other side. And if this is the case, you just want to bring back up the like pre-butting that your first speaker did and demonstrate why it was effective, or demonstrate why the other speaker didn't engage with it, or why it defeats their response. Another like explicit way of dealing with this is by making concessions. So if your first speaker says, listen, we're okay if this thing goes wrong or this is a harm, because like on weighing, the benefit that we get is more important. So if they make a concession, you want to reassert that weighing. And if they outframe, say, something that the other side uses as refutation against your case, you want to show why whatever response and whatever refutation the other side brought up isn't important, again, by using your first speaker's framing. The other more like nuanced way in which this happens, like over time that you get better at spotting, is like by implicitly like pre-addressing some responses. So what this would mean is like pieces of analysis or evidence that are brought up by your partner that if you expand upon are able to contradict the other team's responses to your case. So even just an example of saying like, for example, this country did this policy and it worked because of this. If the other side brings up a mechanistic like refutation against your case, and in that example, they use this mechanism and shows that it works because of X, Y, or Z reasons, you can and should bring that back up as a second speaker and explain why this thing that your partner said pre-refuted their case. An important note when you're doing this, especially if it is like a few lines of analysis or an example, make it clear that your partner did say that. And if you can, like say when they said that. So like at the end of their second argument, for example. And I just say that because a lot of judges will miss things, especially like small lines or like examples some of the time. And so it helps always just as a second speaker to be tying back your rebuilding and your refutation to your first speaker, but especially in those instances when you're bringing out something that was explicit in the last speech, you want to make it really clear that it happened. Okay, so now like that's kind of the rebuilding aspect of like directly addressing the refutation that the other team brought forward. I now want to talk about like rebuilding in terms of like making a case stronger, right? So I think the most important thing for you to be as the second speaker is you need to be critical of your partner's speech. A very easy thing to do, you can't really do this much during COVID times, but during when people would debate in a room, something that I would always do that was really helpful is during your partner's speech, just occasionally glance back at the panel and the judges. And if they look confused during a certain argument, or they're just kind of like, squinting, holding their pen, not writing anything down, that would be a part of your partner's case that you want to like re-explain, maybe say it slower or in more like clear layman's terms, and make sure that the panel really understands that. But also being critical of your partner's speech just by seeing lines of analysis or links that they might miss, right? Because this is something that happens all the time, or even if it isn't a link that they're missing, just something that they say at the end of an argument and then move on. And if it's something that's really important, you want to reassert it again, explain why it's important, and make sure that it's clearly there for the judges to see so they can understand that you like fully fleshed out this argument or fulfilled this burden or are winning on this clash. The other thing with making an argument stronger is, like in whips, for example, you can't bring new arguments. In the DPM or DLO, you can't bring you can bring new arguments, but you shouldn't have entirely all new arguments. But in rebuilding, when you are making something stronger, you can fill in like complementary lines of analysis or examples. And in a whip, like you can still bring in like new examples that show things or new analogies. You just can't bring in new material that isn't contingent on your partner's arguments. So it has to be things that rely on what was brought up in your extension. But another thing to do here is, let's say your cross bench and your refutation to them, it was entirely built upon your mechanism, right? When you're bringing in new lines of analysis or new examples, you want to focus it on like that aspect of your case and flesh it out more, because that's one, like where you're weaker. That's also just the part of the case that the panel is like looking at now the most, and that in the discussion will probably be the thing that they hinge a lot of their discussion on you about, because the other team talked about it a lot and because they brought up a lot of things to like take it down. Another really good way of just making parts of your case stronger is just by making concessions and showing why, even if like first third of constructive, argument 1 of 3 isn't true, argument 2 and 3 combined still mean that you win the debate. That's especially a good thing to do if like one part of your case is really refuted and the others aren't, or even if the others are, just making those mitigations where you're trying to make it like more likely that you're being able to be pulled through. And again, that's all things that are kind of contextual. So the last thing just with rebuilding is to tie rebuilding into your like comparative analysis and your analysis on clashes. So like in seminars before, I've seen there's been like discussions of like comparatives and clashes. So I think that should be a thing that's well explained. But if you do want more of an in-depth explanation on that, someone just like type it in the chat and I can do that. So when you're doing your rebuilding, I think a good way of structuring it is less of just going, I will rebuild my partner's first argument and their second argument and your third argument. But in a second speech, at least for me, I think it's really strategically beneficial to like center your speech either around like different clashes. So like, will this policy work? Will it be effective? Or just questions in the round. So like, what is the interest of the government? Or like, what is the interest of the United States in this like IR round? Does this policy fit into that? What are the like weighing of the benefits and costs of like doing this initiative? If you break it down on those levels, what you're able to do is like, say this is what the other team brought up, refute that, and then compare it to your partner's case, and then make that case even stronger. So when you're bringing up the other side, you're weakening them and then ending off with your case that's already been made stronger. And just if the last thing judges hear in like a certain, section of your speech is about why your team is really good, and that's the note that's left on, that's generally something that's really good. Or also just bringing it down back into like a comparative and a clash-based analysis that also works really well for the thing I was just talking about in terms of making it stronger, where you're able to say, even if we lose on this clash, we still beat on this one, win the debate on this one because of X, Y, or Z reasons. Or even if this is a wash, we still win on this because of X, Y, Z reasons. Okay, any questions about rebuilding? You can just type them in the chat. No? Okay, cool. So now I'm going to talk about refutation, which is my favorite part of debate and probably my favorite part of doing second speeches, and why I mainly speak second, because I get to do more refutation. So before just getting into like an explanation of how refutation works and how to do it well, I'm just going to go over a few don't do's. And these are pretty basic things, maybe some things that you've heard before, but I think it's important to say because it's something that even at a high level of debate, a lot of people will do because they just feel confident in the things that they're saying, and it can end up being really weak. So like the first thing to not do is just a one-liner response, which is just what it sounds like saying, this is what the other team said, it's untrue because 1 or 2 sentences. Because in those 1 or 2 sentences, even if they sound really compelling, like even if you're just saying very basic facts that sound really logical, if the other team can deconstruct the assumptions that are underneath those 2 sentences, and they have 2 minutes to do all of that, they can build a really compelling case why the initially true thing isn't that true. And also just because like one-liner responses can very quickly just get glossed over by judges if they aren't paying a lot of attention, and most of the time they are just things that are dismissive. And if the second speaker comes up and just spends like 30 or 20 seconds on that, that's already way more material and like content and analysis than that you spent on it. The other thing I would say is target only the weakest part of the cases. So like the argument that came out in the last minute that wasn't very strong, or something that isn't very irrelevant to the round but didn't make very much sense, even if you have even if the other team says something that you think is entirely and totally true and speaks to your heart and your worldview deeply, if it's the thing that their case hinges on, and the thing that gets them to win on a clash or fulfill a burden, that's the thing that you want to be targeting. Sorry, excuse me. Even if your response to it isn't a 10 out of 10 or isn't entirely taking it down, especially when starting out, you want to think about those important things and how to build up responses to them. And even if, say, OG comes into the round and has a great case, they have one kind of weak thing in the DPM, but in the PM and the rebuilding, it's all really good, and you're CO, you want to engage in what OG has that's really good, because you might not be able to beat them and get the one, but if you're just engaging in the team that's doing really well, that will still bring you up higher in the placement of the round, especially in VP. And more in CP, like if Gov brings a case that sounds like really true but isn't tight but is just weighted, if you're able and focusing on the thing that's most important, you're more able to like eventually realize what the assumptions are of that case and deal with it on that basis. So you always want to be targeting like the strongest part of the constructive. Another don't do is just to respond to a case or like an argument with an example or an analogy, but then not explain that example or analogy at all. I think people do that a lot when they say an example or analogy that they think it's really common sense by what they mean. So for example, if you're talking about like the importance of regulation and someone says, well, we need regulation because look at the 2008 financial crash. There's a lot of things that you could say about regulation in the 2008 financial crash that would take extremely different arguments about the role of regulation in like certain financial and banking sectors, right? And so whenever you use an example, you want to make it very clear as to what you're using it to prove, because other teams can either just say, well, it's unclear what they're trying to prove there, and then they might just fill in the gaps with something that's weak or refute it, or they just take an assumption from that isn't the one that you were trying to say, and then that becomes what you said in the round, because it's what every other team engages with. And that's one of the most annoying things to like ever happen to you in debate, right? So always explain your examples or your analogies. Another thing is don't do integrated refutation where you don't flag when you are doing refutation or when you have refuted something. I think doing integrated refutation is something that like is good and lots of speakers do it. I think it's kind of a meme that like, you know, people will be like, oh, refutation is integrated and then not do any integrated rebuttal or like any rebuttal at all. But especially when you're starting out, if you're integrating rebuttal into your speech, like and doing that comparative analysis, that's great. But make sure after you've refuted something to say, not say like, I just refuted this, but be like, when you give analysis or an example, you say this takes down like OO's mechanism, which means that like their impacts are unlikely to be achieved, or this means that whatever impacts CG get from their extension are outweighed by our case, where you want to make it explicit what like the impacts, not like impacts of like arguments, but impacts in terms of the weighing of the round and the position of the round, like what your refutation is doing. Another thing not to do is contradict the logic of your own case in responses. I talked about this in like rebuilding, but just make sure that when you're doing refutation, it's all contingent on your case. Like a really good case and like set of speeches fit together very well and operate under the same sets of assumptions and draw deeply from one another. And so you want to do that. And lastly, in refutation, don't just repeat what your partner said and say, well, my partner said this, so that means what they said isn't true. Okay, now into like refutation like properly. So the first thing I want to go over is just like a basic explanation of how arguments work and are set up in debate. So every argument starts with an idea, and then there's the analysis, and then beneath that is the evidence, right? And so when you're doing your refutation, the idea is generally the hardest thing to refute, because most people's ideas are like true and relevant to the motion. And then the analysis is like the middle ground, and the evidence is probably the easiest thing to refute. But the idea is also the thing that if you refute, you completely take down that case, and the analysis and the evidence don't matter. And if you take down the analysis, the evidence doesn't matter. So you want to be targeting the top of that, like the top of that chain, where you want to be thinking about reasons why the idea behind the case isn't true or isn't important. And that's where things like framing really come into play, where you're able to say, well, even though this is something that like is true, it isn't important in this context because of these certain reasons. And that means that the case my partner gave you is what's most important in this, right? We're also just thinking about ways of, like, in prep time, what ideas are the other teams going to present, and how can you like preemptively construct a case that is contradictory to that, for example, right? But also, I think engaging in the idea is generally pretty difficult, but I think it's a good tip to focus on like the analysis and the links that other teams provide to like use their evidence, rather than just having quibbles over the evidence in the round. Because I think, at least in my experience, like people will just say things in debate that are true as evidence, and I've never heard of it before. And when I'm judging, I've never heard of it before. And when debates are based just on the evidence, it can become like very confusing for panelists to like decide who's right. So the next thing on like refutation is that you can't respond to everything that especially if you're a whip, like you can't respond to everything that every other person on the other side of the bench said in the round, right? So you want to be thinking about the round, and like even starting from this like in prep time, is you want to be thinking about what are the things that each team has to prove in order to win, and you want to attack those steps. You want to attack like the link that they're able to tie like their case into their burden, or even just like the mechanism that they're using in order to achieve their impact, right? Even if there's a place where you think you can really take them down, if it's not something that's going to benefit how they stand in the round, that's probably not something that you should be doing and focusing your time on. Just another quick note, like a really good way to realize what are the important things in another team's speech and where you should take them down on it is they usually say when something's really important in their own speech, right? Or they usually explain, this is how we win the debate, right? Whips do this especially. So like if you're the CO whip, you can just see how the CG whip like explains like how their case is and why they win. And you just want to take the things that they say are the linchpins of their case and contradict it or outweigh it, or like provide framing as to why it isn't that important, right? So yeah, you want to find the bits of analysis of characterization of mechanisms that are critical to the other cases and contradict them. I think the other thing that, like, if that doesn't work, which it might not in every round, like lots of cases aren't entirely bulletproof, but they're like very strong, and you might just be in a room where you don't have any spec or have never thought about this topic deeply before. That's definitely happened to me. And so what's a good strategy to do then is to summarize team speeches and summarize these parts of their speeches, like the key linchpins, how they like achieve their path to victory or whatever. You want to summarize these into core components and then address the key parts of each. So for example, in just like a basic round about like this house regrets something, right? If you're in opposition, you want to like summarize the gov bench into why is like this thing bad? What is the counterfactual, and why is that likely to be the counterfactual? And then why is the counterfactual better, right? So in those four components, you want to like fill in what are the things each team said, and then go through it and evaluate it. Sorry, not four teams, four speakers, and like address the key parts of all of the analysis that they give there. Or if they don't, fill in those things, you want to bring that up and say why that's something that should be punishing for them in the round. I also think just in refutation, like in the same way that you want to look at what your partner said, like implicitly or explicitly in rebuilding, you want to do that in refutation too, and use what your partner said as a building off point into your refutation. So usually I begin my speeches with rebuilding just so I'm able to kind of flesh out where my team stands, and then use that into addressing the other team, and then pull back some of the lines of like rebuilding or like repeating of constructive that I said to use that as refutation, because it does make your case stronger when you are using it to refute the other side, and you're not just bringing in things that have never been said before or touched on in the second speech in order to take down the other speakers. Okay, so now just on like when opposing teams make true arguments, because this is something that happens a lot and always sucks if you have to refute it, right? So something that is just true and it doesn't seem to have flaws, not that you can like realize in like the minutes before your speech. What you want to do here is contradict and argue against the underlying like framework, or like an easier word to understand is like perspective of that case. So I have a couple of like examples to make this more clear, because I think this is like something that's important and like hard to just understand from the words I've been using. So in a lot of rounds, there's a clash. Like a big thing in a lot of debate rounds is about achieving political and societal change, especially for like the most marginalized and vulnerable in our society, right? So common like clashes or frameworks within like this issue is like on one side, teams will generally be arguing for like electoralism, like more people being represented in the halls of power as a way of achieving that change. And if they make really true arguments or good arguments as to why their mechanism gets them that thing, what you should do is like counter with another way of achieving political and societal change, which would be like, for an example, like the building of mass movements, right? So if the other team is talking about, or I think a good example for this was a round I was in at Nautic, where it was about should their like education money go towards post-secondary, or I think it was like pre-kindergarten, like childcare benefits or something like that. And like, I think that's a pretty clear example of this round, because on one side, you have more people having like a boost earlier on, so they can like more easily achieve like a basic level of material well-being, so they can participate in a mass movement or organizing or politics in that sense. But on the other end, you make it more easier for people, especially those from like marginalized backgrounds, to enter the halls of power. And so when teams make something that is true, what you want to do is counter it on a different perspective and a different way of thinking of getting the goal, rather than just trying to say why they don't get that goal, because if the argument is true, it's unlikely that the judges are going to believe you. Another good example in like the political and societal change, like flipping of frameworks. So if one side talks about like representation within government, another side will talk about like incentive changes. And like incentive changes tying more into mass movements and like direct pressure for a government to do progressive things, versus like representation of more people who are progressive doing those things themselves. And you want to give reasons that like whatever goal they're trying to achieve is unlikely given whichever like side of that each team chooses. I also think it's important in like political and societal change rounds in the second speaker just to bring up like different important things about that. So just like addressing direct improvements of the well-being of vulnerable people that come from your case. If the other team is arguing why they get better representation or electoralism, like in order for one group's like perspectives in power, you're able to argue for like just making those people's well-being better. That's something that isn't directly refuting their case on its terms, because it might be something that's true, but it's something else that you can build and you can outweigh it. Yeah, any questions about refutation or anything that was unclear about that? Or that you would like more of an example on and you didn't quite understand? All right, cool. The last thing I'll say is don't overclaim your rebuttal. Like if you refute a line of analysis and the other team, it's totally cool to just say we've taken down like this line of analysis, which is able to take down their other argument. Don't just say you've completely destroyed their case or something like that, because the judges are less likely to buy it. But just show what your refutation did and why that's something that is significant. Okay, so now we'll talk about weighing, which is like the more meta aspect and something that is much more contextual to a round than rebuilding your refutation. Because weighing is basically just like the contextualizing Oh, sorry, I see a question, so I'll address that now. What do you do if someone completely strawmans your partner's case? So I think another thing here is like if they just strawman or mischaracterize like a bit of your case, because that's also something that happens a lot, where they like take a line of analysis and say it in a slightly different way that sounds kind of the same, but makes it a lot weaker, where you just want to reassert what your partner's case was and point out where they mischaracterized their argument, right? So, for example, if your partner makes the claim that like if we increase taxes on the rich, it makes it less likely for like them to invest money in like research or something, and the other team says that they're saying that we shouldn't tax the rich because the rich like fund and fuel research. That just isn't true. Like governments mainly do that. You want to say like that they're like point out how they're taking what your partner just said and making it larger, like larger or wider in a different context that makes it seem different. And it's totally like it is a good thing to spend time making that clear and make clear where they stopped understanding what your partner said, and saying what your partner said in like different terms is generally a good way of like making it clear what it is that they said, like simplifying it down or using an example, like taking the big words that debaters use and just using shorter ones. Yeah. So yeah, just about weighing now. So weighing, like you can't take down everything that every other team says, and you won't have enough time to take down everything that they say. So just strategically, sometimes you're going to have to make concessions and then do what's called weighing, which is like people always do this when they weigh, and that's generally how you want to think about it. It's like taking things that are true and that stand in the round and making some of them seem more important, yours, and making the other ones that aren't yours seem less important. So generally, first speakers do and should weigh their own argumentation as they're giving it, but it's really good for you to add more weighing to your own case and use it as a responsive tool, just strategically. And also, like a lot of the time, first speakers don't do weighing, even though it's something that can come out of the first speech. So yeah, it's basically just saying why something does or doesn't matter, not in the context always of the motion, but mainly in the context of like the round of debate that you are participating in. So there's three kind of like main ways of weighing that I want to talk about, and all of these are kind of utilitarian. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about like principled / like non-utilitarian, deontological, whatever you want to call it, ways of weighing. So the first way of weighing that mainly used in debate is exclusivity. Is your impact something that is exclusive, or is it something that other teams also achieve in different ways? So if it's something that's exclusive, then you want to, in your weighing, talk about why this impact is really important and why it's something that like must or should be achieved and voted on in this round. And if it isn't exclusive, then the weighing you want to do is on the mechanisms that impact is achieved, like that achieve that impact, and like compare those mechanisms then. And with that, you also want to be saying like, you know, if both you and the other side are trying to get the same impact in weighing it, you want to be, and also in your refutation, you want to be focusing on the mechanism then, because that's ultimately the weighing that's going to occur between your team and the other team. And weighing is the main thing that judges also use to like draw out comparisons between teams, especially when teams still have material standing, which is generally what happens. And so you want to do that work for the judges before the adjudication happens. So the other type of weighing is just like actor-specific weighing. So is this something that would benefit these actors? And if so, how much? And also, is this something that's in their interest? So in a round that's like this house as a country or this house as an institution or as a social movement, there'll be a clash about what the interests of like that actor are. And in your weighing, you want to weigh the impacts back to what the interests of that actor are. Is this something that fulfills it? Does it make it harder to achieve? Is it complementary to that? Those are all questions that you want to be like asking when you're thinking about giving your speech and answering in your speech to show why your impacts are more important than other teams, or why the impacts that other teams achieved really don't matter that much at the end of the debate. I think, another thing to add under exclusivity, just briefly, is you want to think about whether or not your impact can plausibly lead to the impacts of other teams, or make them more likely to be achieved through other means. So, as I was talking about before in the example of like political or societal change, about if like one team is talking about electoralism and you're talking about like improving the material well-being of like a marginalized group that is like specified in the debate, you can probably say that, hey, if we improve the socioeconomic standing over time of this group, this will probably lead to like better representation in the government somewhere down the line. And in that way, you're making the other side's impact less exclusive. You still need to make yours seem more important because there'll be usually some form of like time delay between both impacts. That's just kind of like a sentence or two that you can say that does help like take down other cases. The last bit on weighing that's important is likelihood. And this is, I think, probably like where you, in certain times, like really bury other teams' cases. Because a lot of times, like in mechanisms or when they're talking about an impact, teams will just say, you know, this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, and then our impact will be achieved. And there might not be a lot of analysis in between the three different this will happens about how that thing is achieved. And as a second speaker, you want to be listening to that and keying into that, like the critical parts of the case. And so what you can just do in those instances is say, you know, on weighing, like OO requires these three things to go right in order for their impact to be achieved. Here's like three reasons why each of these three things are really unlikely to occur. And I think this is where it's good to have spec on like reasons why society is bad, right? So for example, I was in a round recently where one team, it was like, if we get rid of these certain tax exemptions, this money can go into welfare. And then me and my partner just had a bunch of reasons why there are a bunch of incentives against states properly funding welfare, even though it's something that really should be funded well and like funded a lot, why there are incentives against that happening. And we were able to just say, well, this isn't going to happen. So on weighing, it's really unlikely that this benefit on their side is going to occur. It's much more likely that our benefit is going to occur. So in the likelihood weighing, you want to bring in barriers to other teams' cases that they don't even address. Sometimes they might address it and they might say why they're able to get over that barrier. Then you just want to like bring in other ones or say why they don't actually get over that barrier. But like in the likelihood weighing is where you can really bear down on other cases and concede that their thing is true, but just say that it's very unlikely to happen for a bunch of reasons that you can bring in that they hadn't even thought of yet. So the last thing I'll just talk about as a second speaker is how to deal with like principled analysis and principled weighing. This isn't something that comes up a lot in debate because most debates just operate under like a principled framework of like utility or utilitarianism, which is just like maximizing the most good for the most people, or just maximizing utility in terms of whatever that isn't around, be that GDP, happiness, or like most good for the most vulnerable in society. So all arguments are principled in a sense, but most of them are just utilitarianism. And sometimes you'll see like other teams or you and your partner are like using a different principle. And these, when you are like selling your principle in the case, it operates as much as any other argument, but instead of using like logic or kind of like technocratic, this will cause this, you're using like ethic or more like moral philosophy to explain it. And so when other teams are explaining a principle, when you are going to refute it or engage in it, you want to like bring it down to very like simple layman's terms or analogies in order to express it and why it either is or isn't relevant to this motion. And again, you want to use analogies and then explain the importance of those analogies. So like another example from a round I was just in that I think kind of like illustrates this is it was like one of the clashes in the round is whether or not it's okay for people to be persuaded into changing like their religion and spirituality. And I was on op and Gov was saying no. And the thing that me and my partners like, this was an Australs tournament, to construct in this case is we just use an analogy of nationality, where we said, just in this way that you might be persuaded by like someone giving you money or something, or some church having more resources than another, and so you want to go there and they try and persuade you. If you go to the United States or Canada versus some other country, there will be benefits that exist to that. You as an individual are able to weigh up those benefits individually, and like there's no power that limits that like decision making. And nationality is something that exists as a part of your identity, similar to spirituality. And then kind of the last thing just about the difference between nationality and spirituality that we said was just that, it isn't the place of any governing body to say to an individual whether or not like a decision that regards their spirituality is legitimate or not. That's part of like the separation of church and state, where there's different parts of like that analogy there, where you're just taking the thing that's being talked about in the debate, tying it to something similar, using how something similar is commonly thought of to show why the thing in the debate should be thought of that same way, and then just more to kind of strengthen why that analogy is similar to what's going on in the debate. So when teams are saying like, all of their principled analysis doesn't matter because we have this principle and it means we win. And they use all of this like highfalutin language about why that's true. You just want to boil that down to like the core assumptions about like morality or ethics that it's using and operating on, and then deal with that using an analogy. Another important thing just on principles is a lot of the times, especially in like social justice rounds or rounds about inequality, lots of teams will use a principle to argue that society or the government or corporations are required to do something to address past injustices. So for example, in a round that says like this house would tax women like half as much as it would tax men, Gov might do a lot of analysis and good analysis as to why like it's justified to give some benefit to women and non-men because of past injustices. But they also need to tie that into specifically why it's 50% less on taxes. It's not enough for teams to just say we need to do something and then say here are the benefits of doing this thing. They need to prove why we need to specifically do this thing. And they also need to prove why this thing is beneficial, because if they don't, then it's not really addressing the past injustice. So a lot of times, even if teams do have some principle that they say is round winning, it isn't always, and it can be vulnerable to like utilitarian, just like principled, most like general debate argumentation. Yeah. Any questions on any of that on weighing? I also just think that's generally where, especially as a whip, you can do most of the damage in the round, because you can like summarize other teams very briefly. But even as like a DPM or a DLO, you want to be weighing your partner's case against whatever you think is going to come up on back half, or whatever is likely to come up, either from POIs or just trajectory of the round or what's likely to be an extension. Just because when you're able to do that preemptively, it makes it a lot easier for you to stay in the round. Any questions? All right, I think I have a little bit of time left, so I'm just going to briefly talk about prep time as a second speaker. Just because so far I've kind of covered like the tools you want to have in your toolbox, but just in terms of prep time. Oh, I see a question here. How do you respond to an in before X from the speaker before you? Brandon, can you explain more what you mean by that question? Oh, preemptive rebuttal. So I'd say like the way that you would engage with like pre-rebuttal before your case, or like would be the same way that you would engage in anything else, right? So you want to see like what the assumptions about it are, like all of the questions that I kind of talked about in rebuilding at the beginning about how does this address like my case or my partner's case, where does it attack it on, and what are the assumptions of that. That just then translates to, okay, they attack the mechanism, need to like either say why they didn't take down the other parts of it, or here are other ways that the mechanism works that aren't attacked. We're just adding more analysis to that. If they're trying to diminish your impacts and make theirs just way stronger, you want to show why your impacts are like especially important. Another just important good thing to do with pre-refutation is just do not say the thing that they say you're going to say, right? I think that's a big part of like prepping strategically, is having a case that clashes against the other teams, but also isn't entirely predictable, right? This isn't something that you can always do, especially if you're on OG, on just a this house would do this motion. It can be hard to kind of shake things up and make it hard for other teams to like pre-refute you. But at least in terms of the analysis that you're doing, the way that you're proving things just shouldn't be the things that the other teams say don't work. And if it is, try and come up with different analysis in that time. Was that helpful, Brandon? I'll wait for his response and just briefly talk about prep time now. So as a second speaker, I think in prep time, I think for me, something that I did like initially that hindered me a lot, and this is just kind of personal, it's not very like generalized, other people might prep differently and like other strategies might work for them. But I would write a lot out in prep time as a second speaker, and then two things would happen. Either I would get into the round and I'd just be reading and looking at my notes too much and I'd like get distracted, or all the stuff that I would write would be really relevant to not the debate that I'm currently in, but like another version of the room where different cases were run and like the clashes were different. And so something that I started doing as a second speaker is just, I would have like one piece of paper where I would brainstorm all the stuff that I thought would be said on Gov and all the stuff that I thought would be said on Op, and just writing like quick like headlines of like responses to like either outweigh like my front or back half or like refute the other teams. And then I would only write my own speech based on, I would have a piece of paper that during my, or like multiple pieces of paper if it needed that during my partner's speech, where I would write down kind of like the headlines and subtitles of all of their points and fill in the analysis there and like write either in like a different color or with like a star next to it where I would add something, either because it was weak or it was just important and I thought it needed more, or there was something, you know, we came up in prep and they forgot to say. And then I would just have another line of just another piece of paper of just like a line through it, other teams' arguments on one side, my responses on the other, just so all of the stuff that I would be looking at while I was up there giving my speech, like prompting me to say stuff, would be really relevant to like the round that was happening. I know some people also, like when I was starting out, like the idea of going into a round with nothing or basically nothing written down, especially on front half, was really intimidating. But I think that's something maybe even just to do in practice if you're trying to get better at second speaking, or you have a partner who you really debate with and they like first speaking, or you want to second speak more, just to like kind of train yourself to be able to come up with those like responses on the spot and focus very clearly on like what is happening in front of you in the round that's going on, rather than like the round that you and your partner imagined in like starting 15 minutes ago. Because teams can just run things that you didn't expect or frame things in different ways. And sometimes they'll be totally off, but they might be able to make it seem like you're totally off. And so you want to be able to engage with that, not just by like dismissing alternative conceptions of the debate, but by like really getting into that and explaining why the way you understand the burdens of this and how the world works is like more true and more relevant than the other teams. I think the other thing about prep time as a second speaker is you want to be helping your partner construct a case that is already preemptive, right? So something I always like to do if I'm second speaking is when the first speaker is just like writing an argument or talking about an argument, just go like, what if op says this, right? And just saying that, like there have been rounds where me and my partner see the motion and we just go, well, what if op says this? And the first 12 minutes of our prep time is coming up with how to deal with that, because it's a really important response. And then from there, we're building our case, where you want to be thinking from the get-go of like building something very strategic and helping your first speaker kind of put that together and construct it in a way that makes sense. For some people who second speak, they might enjoy like constructing the arguments and writing all that stuff out and just giving it to their first speaker. That's something I've seen done, but those are just some tips from my experience. Any other questions before this seminar is over, I guess? Also, just waiting if there's any questions, just to remind people to debate to the Thani, what was it? I have it written down. It was either debate organization or debate, the Thani Debate League, $15. It's the recommended amount. After this, QC will also be hosting a round of debate, so encourage everyone to attend that. It doesn't seem to be any questions. People do have questions about second speaking or just debate. You can message me on Facebook at any time. I'll probably get back to you at some point, probably not too late after you message me. Yeah, that's the seminar. Hope you all enjoyed it.